But I remember this time George got caned, George Harrison, because we were mates at school. And I mean, we never really did anything wrong, but we might have like tight trousers and Ted hairdos, and so that.
The relationship between Paul McCartney and John Lennon, who together are the most famous songwriting duo in the history of rock and roll, is one of the relationships that has been researched and documented the most. However, the relationship between McCartney and George Harrison is a little bit more mysterious and complicated than other relationships. In recent times, Paul McCartney has finally broken his silence regarding the rumors that have been circulating about his tense relationship with George Harrison. Keep an eye out. In order to get a better understanding of the revelations that Paul McCartney has made about George Harrison, let us first take a brief look at the early life of both musicians and the path that led them to become friends. Keep an eye on us as we enter the water. Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942 in Liverpool, England. He currently resides in the United Kingdom. Jim was another name for his father, James, and Mary was the name of his mother. His father was also known as Jim. Because he had such a strong passion for music, Paul's father worked as a cotton salesman, but he also performed as a musician in his spare time. After learning music on his own and becoming so proficient at playing musical instruments, such as the trumpet and the piano, his father eventually became the leader of a music band that was known as Jim Mack's Jazz Band because of his musical abilities. On the other hand, Paul's mother was a nurse and at the time was the primary provider for the family. Her consistent income helped alleviate the burden of financial responsibility, and as a result, they were able to live a life that was not extravagant. Paul was raised alongside his younger brother, Michael, who was also his sibling. They have always been a part of a community in which music has been a way of life. This is due to the fact that their father has always enjoyed playing music in the house. His father attempted to teach him how to play the piano on a few occasions. However, he initially showed no interest in learning how to play the piano. Instead, he preferred to listen to popular songs that were popular during that time period. At the age of 14, Mary, Paul's mother, passed away due to breast cancer. A significant blow was dealt to the entire family by this. Years later, Paul would always attribute his music career to his mother, particularly one of his hit songs titled "Let It Be." This was something that he would say in interviews decades later. He revealed that the title of that song was derived from a dream he had after the passing of his mother. In the dream, she appeared to him and encouraged him to let it be. He used this dream as inspiration for the song's title. A significant factor that played a role in Paul's decision to pursue a career in music was the passing of his mother. In the immediate aftermath of her passing, he was able to make the discovery that he possessed a profound love for music. Additionally, his interest in learning musical instruments increased, and he began with a low-cost instrument that Jim had purchased for him after her passing. Due to the fact that he was completely left-handed, he had a very difficult time making the transition to playing the right string guitar. Following a period of time and a significant amount of practice, he eventually became accustomed to the situation and was able to restring the guitar, which made the process significantly simpler for him. In the beginning, he began by playing songs that were popular during that era. In the year 1957, Paul was introduced to John Lennon by the latter, while the latter was performing with his skiffle band known as the Quarrymen at a church program. Paul found John's performance to be absolutely mesmerizing. Following the program, they were introduced to one another, and the connection that they shared was truly enchanted. It was like that one relationship that is only a day old, but seems like they have known themselves for their entire lives because of how they have been together. They talked about a wide range of topics, including their abilities as songwriters and their appreciation for a variety of musical styles at the same time. Next, John made a request for Paul to become a member of his band group. At this point, a magical occurrence was just getting started. The friendship that Paul and John shared eventually became very significant. It was a massive powerhouse formed by the partnership of two creative individuals who possessed great abilities in the field of music, increasing the amount of time they spent together, writing songs, practicing, and devoting a significant amount of time to their craft in an effort to achieve the best possible results. During that time period, the individuals who served as their primary sources of inspiration or icons included, amongst others, Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly. Because of the songs that they wrote together, the Beatles were able to establish a strong foundation and quickly rise to fame. The fact that Paul attended Liverpool Institute does not change the fact that he was never really interested in academic work, despite the fact that he did very well in school. At the beginning of the 1960s, Paul, along with 3 other music enthusiasts, formed a band and performed in clubs. The moment they were introduced to manager Brian Epstein was the catalyst for their meteoric rise to fame. At that time, manager Brian had a great deal of influence, and he was able to assist in the signing of a recording deal between them and the Parlophone label, which is owned by EMI. At this point, the Beatles rose to prominence and became a household name in the annals of music history all over the world. Paul gradually became the band's de facto leader, beginning with the release of the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1968. He was the source of inspiration for the majority of the band's musical and film projects. Several of his songs from the Beatles, such as And I Love Her Yesterday, Eleanor Rigby, and Blackbird, are among the songs that have been covered the most in the history of music. Although his primary role with the Beatles was that of a bassist, he also contributed to the band's music by playing a variety of other instruments, such as keyboards, guitars, and drums. Following the dissolution of the Beatles, he made his debut as a solo artist with the release of the album McCartney in 1970. Subsequently, he went on to form the band Wings with his first wife, Linda, and Denny Lane. Wings became one of the most successful bands of the 1970s thanks to Paul's leadership among the band members. The songs My Love Band on the Run, Listen to What the Man Said, Silly Love Songs, and Mull of Kintyre were among the songs that he penned or co-penned for one of their #1 hits in the United States or the United Kingdom. The year 1980 marked the beginning of his solo career, and since 1989, he has been performing as a solo artist on tour. In addition to Wings, he has had #1 hits in the United Kingdom and the United States, with songs such as Uncle Albert / Admiral Halsey, Coming Up, Pipes of Peace, Ebony and Ivory with Stevie Wonder, and Say 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 with Michael Jackson. Additionally, he has been involved in projects that promote international charities related to animal rights, seal hunting, landmines, vegetarianism, poverty, and music education. These projects have been in addition to his involvement in music. Over the course of his career, Paul McCartney has penned or co-penned a record 32 songs that have topped the Billboard Hot 100 chart. As of 2009, he had sold 25.5 million RIA-certified units in the United States. In addition to being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once as a member of the Beatles in 1988 and again as a solo artist in 1999, he has also been awarded an Academy Award, a Primetime Emmy Award, 18 Grammy Awards, an appointment as a member of the Order of the British Empire in 1965, and a Knight Bachelor appointment in 1997 for his contributions to the music industry. When the year 2024 rolls around, he is considered to be one of the wealthiest musicians in the world, with an estimated fortune of £1 billion. Without a shadow of a doubt, the early years of Paul McCartney's life and career were built upon a foundation of suffering, a personal loss, as well as a profound love and passion for music. Through his friendship with John and George, he was able to have a significant impact on his life and career, which ultimately resulted in an incredible and successful career for both himself and the band. First things first, before we delve into the story of how George Harrison came into existence, let's talk about his early life and the path he took in his music career. In the early years of his life, George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, at the address 12 Arnold Grove, which is located in Wavertree, Liverpool. His parents, Harold Hargreaves Harrison and Louise, had 4 children, and he was the youngest of the bunch. George's father, Louise, was a shop assistant of Irish Catholic descent, and his father, Harold, was a bus conductor who had worked as a ship steward for the White Star Line. His father was also a member of the White Star Line service. The only sister he had was named Louise, and he had 2 brothers named Harold and Peter. It was especially important for George's mother to provide her children with support. The only thing she desired for her children was for them to be happy, and she realized early on that nothing made George happier than making music. She wanted nothing more than for them to be happy. It was well known among her friends that Louise had a loud singing voice that could sometimes startle guests by rattling the windows of the Harrisons' home. Louise was a music enthusiast who was very enthusiastic about music. During the time that Louise was carrying George, she frequently listened to the weekly broadcast that Radio India had to offer. Every Sunday, she tuned into the mystical sounds evoked by sitars and tablas, hoping that the exotic music would bring peace and calm to the baby that was still in the womb, as stated by Joshua Green, who is George's biographer. Before relocating to Upton Green Speak, George Harrison resided at Arnold Grove until the 1st of January in the year 1950. 1948 was the year that he started attending Dovedale Primary School. The examination was successful, and he went on to study at Liverpool Institute High School for Boys from 1954 until 1959. Despite the fact that the institute did provide a music course, George was dissatisfied with the fact that there were no guitars available. He also believed that the school instilled nervousness in its students. To name just a few, George Formby, Cab Calloway, Django Reinhardt, and Hoagie Carmichael were among the earliest musical influences that Harrison acknowledged. While he was out on his bicycle at the beginning of 1956, he had a realization. The song Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis Presley inspired him to become interested in rock and roll after he heard it being played from a house in the neighborhood. There were times when he would sit in the back of the classroom and draw guitars in his school books. He would later comment that he was completely obsessed with guitars. Additionally, he mentioned Slim Whitman as an additional early influence. Slim Whitman was the very first and only person I ever witnessed playing a guitar, either as a live broadcast on television or as a photograph of him in a magazine. Guitars were unquestionably going to be arriving. Around the age of 14, George received an offer from a friend to purchase a guitar for him. Next, his mother made the purchase of the guitar. A friend of George's father taught him how to play the songs Whispering Sweet Sue and Dinah. George learned how to play these songs. As a result of being influenced by Donegan's music, George, along with his brother Peter and a friend named Arthur Kelly, established a skiffle band called the Rebels. Even though his father encouraged him to continue his education, George dropped out of school when he was 16 years old and worked as an apprentice electrician at Blackler's, a department store in the neighborhood. He worked there for a number of months. Through the use of the pseudonym Carl Harrison, George made reference to Carl Perkins during the first tour of Scotland that the band embarked on in the year 1960. Once upon a time, George had joined a band that went by the name The Quarrymen as a guitarist. This had been accomplished through the assistance of a friend. Between the years 1960 and 1960, promoter Alan Williams made arrangements for the band, which at that time was known as the Beatles, to perform at the Indra and Kaiser Keller clubs in Hamburg, which were both owned by Bruno Koschmider. When George was deported from Hamburg because he was too young to work in nightclubs, their first residency in Hamburg came to an abrupt end. After Brian Epstein took over as their manager in December 1961, he worked to improve their reputation and eventually landed them a recording contract with EMI. Love Me Do was the first single released by the band, and it reached its highest position on the record retailer chart at number 17. By the time their debut album, Please Please Me, was released in the beginning of 1993, Beatlemania had already begun. When George was performing on stage with the band, he was known as the Quiet Beatle because he was frequently serious and focused. This moniker came about when the Beatles arrived in the United States in the early part of 1964. At the time, George was suffering from a case of strep throat and a fever, and he was advised by his doctor to limit his speaking as much as possible until he was able to perform on The Ed Sullivan Show as planned. Consequently, the media took notice of George's apparent laconic behavior. The nature and public appearances that took place during that tour, as well as the subsequent nickname, remained, much to his contentment. Nevertheless, George was well known for more than just his humorous nickname. He was particularly knowledgeable about soul music, which led to him serving as a scout for new American releases for the Beatles. His talent allowed him to do this. Around the time that Rubber Soul was released in 1965, he had already begun to steer the other members of the Beatles in the direction of Indian classical music through his use of the sitar on Norwegian Wood, as well as folk rock through his fascination with the Byrds and Bob Dylan. As George continued to cultivate his interest in non-Western instrumentation, he played Swarmandal on strawberry fields for an indefinite amount of time. In the latter half of 1966, George's interest in the Beatles had shifted away from the band. It was because of this that he decided to include Eastern gurus and religious leaders on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band's album, which was released in 1967. A song called Within You Without You, which was inspired by Indian music, was his only composition on the album, and no other member of the Beatles contributed to it. In addition to playing the sitar and the tambourine, he was accompanied on the track by musicians from the London Asian Music Circle, who played the tabla, dilruba, and swarmandal pieces. After some time had passed, he made a comment about the Sgt. Pepper album, stating that it was a pivotal moment in the history of the music industry. Roughly half of the songs are ones that I enjoy listening to, while the other half I couldn't stand. Around the time that George Harrison was nearing the end of his career with the Beatles, Dylan and the band were a significant musical influence on him. During his trip to Woodstock in late 1968, he became friends with Bob Dylan and found himself drawn to the band's sense of communal music making, as well as the creative equality among the band members. He also found himself drawn to the collective nature of the band. In 1969, on January 10th, he resigned from his position with the Beatles. On the other hand, he finally came back 12 days later and continued to work on projects with the band. After his return, George exercised a greater degree of creative control than he had previously, and he rejected suggestions for modifications to his music, particularly those made by Paul McCartney. Due to his increased productivity, he had accumulated a collection of compositions that had not yet been released by the time they decided to end their relationship. George's final recording session with the Beatles took place on January 4, 1970. During this session, he, Paul McCartney, and Starr recorded overdubs to the song Let It Be for the soundtrack album of the same name. How did George and Paul McCartney first become acquainted with one another? Keep an eye on us as we enter the water. The friendship between George Harrison and Paul McCartney and Harrison first became acquainted while riding the school bus together. They both received their high school education from Liverpool Institute. Harrison and McCartney had both passed their 11+ examinations, but they had done so 1 year apart. This allowed them to both enroll in a prestigious school located in the heart of the city. From the very beginning, Harrison had a strong aversion to attending the Liverpool Institute High School, which was a highly regarded academic institution. George Harrison did not have a warm and fuzzy feeling when he thought back on his time spent at Liverpool Institute High School. At that moment, the darkness began to descend. If you are here, stand there, be quiet, and take a seat. Just to get it out of your system, you could resort to punching other people. That was the most difficult period of my life. An opportunity to study music was available to male students at the Liverpool Institute High School. Nevertheless, this did not cover either rock and roll or guitars, which proved to be a source of disappointment for George Harrison. Despite the fact that he did not participate, this statement could have been made in reference to his secondary education in general. A significant portion of his time in class was spent drawing his preferred guitars. The school, on the other hand, did not find George's disruptive behavior to be particularly impressive. And while Paul McCartney's music colleague John Lennon's similar unruliness was accompanied by signs of artistic talent, George had no obvious redeeming features. This was the case while they were both at Quarry Bank. His disdain for the Liverpool Institute was palpable, and the regard that he had for the institution was reciprocal. When George was in school, his teachers dismissed him as someone who would, at best, be doing factory work. Paul McCartney, on the other hand, was not regarded in this manner. Despite the fact that he was not a major academic star, he demonstrated promise. Paul was responsible for his behavior and, for the most part, stayed away from the naughty step. Paul, very much like George, had no interest in studying music while he was in school. He too did not feel that there was any connection between the dusty scores that they studied in music class and the rock and roll that they listened to. The age gap between Paul and George presented both a practical and psychological obstacle when it came to connecting with one another in the playground. A group of children from the same year group hung out together. The majority of the other forms of fraternizing consisted of brief nods. However, the social rules were less stringent when they were not being enforced inside the school. Both boys rode the same bus into town, despite the fact that they lived in different parts of the city. In the future, George would explain that this is the point at which their lives would intersect. Due to the fact that he was wearing the same uniform as I was, and was heading in the same direction, I began hanging out with him. Later on, George made a joke about how Paul had struck him as peculiar. He is chuckling to himself while sitting by himself. I had the impression that we were dealing with a real nut. In spite of this, the two young men quickly discovered that they had similar musical preferences. At that time, Paul McCartney was learning to play the trumpet that his father had given him as a birthday present, but he was not enjoying playing it. He traded it in for a guitar, which he did not hesitate to pick up right away. By that time, they were exchanging notes. They worked together to study chord charts and carefully observed other musicians as they attempted more complex sequences by themselves. They even went so far as to travel across the city in order to meet a man who was familiar with a new and magical chord. In spite of the fact that he was the senior partner at this point in time, Paul was the senior partner. As a result of his more extensive musical background and innate abilities, he was able to master instruments without conscious effort. He was self-assured enough to approach John Lennon as a musician on par with, if not superior to, Lennon by the time he was 15 years old. Very quickly, there was a need for a third guitarist quarryman to fill the position. As George was still only 14 years old, Paul knew only the man, or more accurately, the boy. Even though Lennon was opposed to the idea of a child joining his band, Paul was able to convince him to give George a chance to try out. It is well known that the audition took place on the top deck of a late-night bus, which was completely empty. The performance that George gave was raunchy, and it was flawless. At this point in time, George may not have possessed the same level of musical creativity as Paul, but he was extremely dedicated. It was clear that his countless hours of practice on the guitar had paid off, as he was eventually accepted into the band. The friendship dynamics between George and Paul were strengthened as a result of George's induction into the band. Their friendship developed into something more akin to a brotherhood by the time it was over. As reported by Vogue, George Harrison tied the knot with model Pattie Boyd on January 21, 1966, thereby establishing a marriage that would go down in the annals of rock and roll history. Paul McCartney was the only other member of the band to attend the wedding, and he served as Harrison's best man, according to Boyd's memoir, Wonderful Tonight, George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and Me, which was published in 2008. This was despite the fact that the wedding took place during the height of the Beatles' fame. In the course of the ceremony, Boyd observed that Paul McCartney was seated in the middle of Harrison's parents. In the midst of a lull, he took it upon himself to provide entertainment for David and Boo, who are the younger half-brothers of Boyd. There was a change in the power dynamics within the band when the Beatles released their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. This album marked the beginning of the conflict between Paul and George. The ideas that Paul McCartney had for the album were reportedly the primary inspiration for the creative process. Throughout the years that followed, Paul never stopped working toward the goal of leading his own projects, one of which was the Magical Mystery Tour. Afterwards, in 1968, the Beatles went to India to study transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Yogi was the teacher of the practice. George Harrison's fascination with Eastern philosophy and the ways in which it could serve as a source of inspiration for the band was a major incentive for the trip. However, the other members of his band were not quite as present as he was. George was said to have shut down any attempts to engage him in any of these conversations throughout the time that the other members of the band were discussing their upcoming album, making plans for their music, and conversing about it. He reiterated that they were there to meditate and not to discuss music. When Paul called George the following year to discuss the band leaving Apple Records, it was reported that George disagreed with Paul's decision and requested that they remain on the label until further notice. Their friendship was severely damaged as a result of this disagreement, which was further exacerbated by the fact that George's talent was not being acknowledged for many years. It was not until 1969, when the Beatles recorded and released the album Abbey Road, that George Harrison was given the same level of recognition as John Lennon and Paul McCartney. It was the final album that the band recorded, and it was also the first album for which George was appropriately recognized for his songwriting. Here Comes the Sun and Something were two of the album's most notable songs when they were released. In the years that followed, legendary musicians such as Ray Charles, Elvis Presley, Smokey Robinson, and Frank Sinatra covered the song in question. There was a time when John Lennon referred to it as the album's best track. Nevertheless, by the time the Beatles recorded Abbey Road in 1969, the band had already been disbanded due to a variety of grievances, and George's was that he did not have creative control and was not recognized for his contributions. It is clear that these frustrations reached a peak during that year, as evidenced by a conversation that was recorded by the author Anthony Fawcett and included in Barry Miles's biography of Paul McCartney, which was published in 1998 and titled Many Years From Now. As McCartney explained to John Lennon, "Well, the thing is, I think that up until now, up until this year, our songs have been better than George's. This year, his songs are at least on par with the ones we have released." The sarcastic compliment that Paul offered was turned down by George Harrison. He stated that this is a myth because the majority of the songs that I wrote this year were written either the previous year or the year before. It's possible that I've reached a point where I don't care in the least whether you like them or not. I just do them. When it came to music, George and Paul did not always share the same opinions. In an interview that took place in 1974, Harrison stated that he would prefer to have Willie Weeks play bass rather than Paul McCartney. "I have the utmost respect for Paul, but that is the truth. Paul is an excellent bass player, but there are times when he can be a little too dominant. I would be more than happy to join a band with John Lennon, but I would never be able to join a band with Paul McCartney." However, this is not a personal issue. If we only consider it from a musical standpoint, it is. Paul McCartney recently reflected on his friendship with George Harrison, admitting he had underestimated his songwriting. While Lennon and McCartney dominated the Beatles' early material, Harrison later contributed classics like Here Comes the Sun and Something. After the band's breakup, George's solo career flourished, earning critical acclaim. In a recent interview, McCartney acknowledged George's late-blooming talent, stating, "At first he wasn't that interested in writing, but when he did, boy did he blossom." Despite past tensions, the two reunited with Ringo Starr in 1994 to work on John Lennon demos. George was assertive in the sessions, insisting on a specific guitar solo and choosing Jeff Lynne as producer. Harrison's legacy extended beyond the Beatles. He received the Billboard Century Award in 1992 and was ranked among the greatest guitarists and songwriters by Rolling Stone. His impact on world music and spiritual themes in pop culture was profound. George and Paul remained close until Harrison's passing on November 29, 2001, from cancer at age 58. Before his death, McCartney visited him in the hospital, describing it as a deeply moving experience, like we were dreaming. On the day George died, Paul called him a wonderful man with a great sense of humor, like my little brother. A year later, Concert for George was held at Royal Albert Hall with McCartney, Starr, and other close friends, honoring Harrison's musical and personal legacy. The song Lumberjack by Monty Python was performed by a number of people, including Eric Idle, who referred to Harrison as one of the few morally good people that rock and roll has produced. You should click the next video that appears on your screen, as well as like and subscribe to this video if you found it entertaining.